Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to what we like to call Lunch with Books. And we'll get to our guests for today in just a minute. It is National Library Week. We're celebrating libraries. If you missed the picture, that's on you. But on the table, you will have schedules for various events that are happening and things you can win here at the library. Next week, on Monday evening, you can watch the film in this room called A Night to Remember, which is the historically accurate Titanic film. And the next day, you will hear from Dr. Art Barbeau, who will lead a discussion of that said film. So you can see the free movie and have maybe popcorn. Am I promising something we can't deliver? We'll have popcorn, I'm sure of it. And then we'll have the discussion the next day. The week after that, Don Feenerty will be back. And his group will talk about how you can save money, which is always a good thing. And the week after that, Pete Chocolate, that's your week, right? The 26th will be here. He has a new book out about statehood and the Civil War in West Virginia. So join us then. Today we're going to tell you about, as you can see on the screen, the lost history of Frederick Douglass in Wheeling, our hometown. And our guests today are John Mueller and Justin McNeil. John is the author of Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C., The Lion of Anacostia, and Mark Twain in Washington, D.C., The Adventures of a Capital Correspondent. He's presented throughout the D.C., Baltimore metropolitan area at venues including Library of Congress, Politics and Prose Bookstore, American Library in Paris, Enoch Pratt Library, D.C. Public Library, and the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. He's a frequent guest on Washington, D.C. radio stations and has been cited by the Washington Post and the Washington City paper, the Cumberland Times News, among others. He's been on C-SPAN's Book TV, C-SPAN's American History TV, among other shows. And his co-presenter today is Justin McNeil, who is an IT professional and has serviced government agencies, nonprofits, corporations, financial and banking institutions, and small businesses within the DC, Baltimore metro area, Western Maryland, Potomac Highlands for the last decade. Okay, so here they are, John and Justin.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I want to thank the Ohio County Public Library for their kind accommodations and hospitality. This presentation is about 61 slides. So it's going to be about an hour and a half, or an hour and 15 minutes. We'll try to end around 1:15, and we gladly take your comments, questions. And if you have any phones or other things that make noise, please silence them right now. So what we'll do is, just because we're streaming live on YouTube, I'll probably be on the microphone here. Justin will be here. We might switch a little bit, but that's how we're going to kind of do this tag team presentation. All right, so yeah, just to give a quick shout out, I wrote this book on Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C. You can find it on, I believe, online through the way you can get books online through this library. I think they might have a couple copies. So if you're interested in learning about Douglass in the last quarter century of his life, you can check that out. So Douglass in West Virginia and Wheeling really starts after the Civil War. These are just a couple prints, and we will quickly get into the history. All right, so following the Civil War, Frederick Douglass made more than a half dozen visits across West Virginia, from the eastern panhandle to the northern panhandle to the Kanawha River Valley, speaking in the communities of Harpers Ferry in Jefferson County, Martinsburg in Berkeley County, Wheeling in Ohio County, where we are today, and Parkersburg in Wood County. During these travels throughout the Mountain State, Douglass was hosted by and spoke alongside newspaper publishers and editors, politicians, and citizens who founded the wild and wonderful state of West Virginia, and leaders within local Black communities, from journalists to educators and college faculty, to clergy, to doctors and business leaders. We hope this presentation today will enliven and enrich the local history and interconnectedness of Frederick Douglass to the city of Wheeling and West Virginians within reformist circles of education, politics, journalism, the Black church, law, and how this local legacy and recognition continues today. All right, so just very quickly as a chronology of Douglass's visits in West Virginia, he visits Wheeling April 8, 1867, which from what I can determine is the first visit or public visit that Douglass makes to the state of West Virginia. In October of 1873, he speaks in Parkersburg. He's actually in company with Arthur Borman, who at that time was serving as United States Senator from West Virginia. He spoke in Martinsburg in July of 1879. He gave a high-profile address in Harper's Ferry at the commencement of Storer College. He spoke about his relationship with John Brown. He then returns to Wheeling. He speaks in Wheeling September 22, 1884. He then made an unscheduled impromptu speech from the back of a rail car in Grafton in 1884, which kind of found that recently. Then he also attended commencement at Storer College in Harper's Ferry in May of 1885. Just as a quick little note, both the events in Harper's Ferry were for commencement services at Storer College, and Douglass made several visits to Harper's Ferry in private and public, so there are more visits that he made to Harper's Ferry, but this is just kind of a quick chronology where he visited about a half dozen different locations and towns in West Virginia. And also he traveled through West Virginia on the B&O Railroad, but some of these he's just kind of passing through. All right, and I know we have a lot of local historians here in the audience, so I'm looking forward to the questions and comments, and if I get anything wrong, you can feel free to shout out. Don't throw anything at me, but please just shout out maybe if I make a small error. All right, so interestingly enough, Douglass is following what is going on in West Virginia in the early 1860s. This is an address or a lecture that Douglass gives in New York City. In January 1864, in New York City at the Cooper Union, Frederick Douglass delivered a lecture, The Mission of the War, in which he argued that the eventuality of the war would be the full abolition of slavery. Douglass referenced Western Virginia as an area where slavery had been, quote, stunned nearly to death. To support his argument, Douglass closely followed the development of West Virginia as a state. So you can see here on the left, or on your right, is this is from the New York Tribune, and then there's a little excerpt where Douglass says Haiti and Liberia are recognized, slavery is humbled in Maryland, threatened in Tennessee, stunned nearly to death in Western Virginia. All right. So, Mr. Douglass in 1867, some may know this building currently stands present day downtown Wheeling. Douglass in 1867 delivered a lecture at the Opera House. So Frederick Douglass spoke in Wheeling on at least two separate occasions in April '67 and in September 1884, as well as he made a ghost visit in 1869, which I'll talk about in just a moment. His several appearances in Wheeling, unrealized and realized, were for a variety of occasions, including the laying of a cornerstone for a local African Methodist Episcopal church, an invitation to lecture by a local literary society, and to attend an Emancipation Day parade as a keynote speaker. I'm sure that if Lunch with Books was around when Frederick Douglass was alive, he would have probably addressed the group today at a Lunch for Books. All right, in '67, Douglass spoke in the original Washington Hall, and in 1884, Douglass spoke in the old Grand Opera House for an Emancipation celebration. So he basically spoke at the original Washington Hall, and then again at its location when the new building was built. I believe there was a fire in 1875 that destroyed the original location. All right, and so when Douglass would speak here, it would bring visitors from Ohio and Pennsylvania. All right, some associates of Mr. Douglass that have connections to West Virginia: Governor Pierpont, Governor Borman, Booker T. Washington. Just for the interest of time, I won't get too much into these connections, but Booker T. Washington attends Wayland Seminary in Washington, D.C. While Frederick Douglass is in Washington, Frederick Douglass spoke at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, which was an institute that Booker T. Washington founded. And he was affiliated with West Virginia, more so around Charleston. All right, some other associates of Mr. Douglass. Henry O. Wagoner's an interesting guy. He's kind of connected to Chicago and Denver. He was originally from Western Maryland, and when he's moving out west, he traveled via the National Road and spent some time in Wheeling. John Robert Clifford, I believe that Mr. Thomas Rod gave a lecture and address here a couple of years ago on J.R. Clifford. He was a pioneering Black lawyer in West Virginia. Douglass was closely connected with him in many different ways. Mr. Clifford had attended Storer College on Harper's Ferry. Blanche Bruce, former Senator Blanche Bruce, he attended the Emancipation Day Parade here in Wheeling in 1891. He was a close friend with Frederick Douglass. They would go to the horse races together. All right, some other, these are a little closer to home, Wheeling associates of Mr. Douglass that I'll get into here. Dr. BHilliard, who, if anyone reads Archiving Wheeling, it's a great website. There's an article on Dr. Hilliard. Archibald W. Campbell, another interesting historical figure that Douglass was closely connected to. And then Professor James McHenry Jones, who's an educator here in Wheeling. And I'll get a little bit more into detail about Douglass's connection to these individuals. All right. Okay, so here is Washington Hall. This is a image of the old original Washington Hall. I won't get into all the details and specifics. I'm sure some people here know that part of the creation of West Virginia, like administratively and legislatively, happened here at that corner. And there, Justin and I last night walked around downtown Wheeling and saw the markers that denoted Washington Hall's history. All right, so the connections of Douglass to West Virginia really start, obviously, West Virginia is not created until during the Civil War, so Douglass's connections with the state don't start until after the Civil War. Douglass did not travel to Virginia and Maryland and south of the Mason-Dixon line until after the Civil War. So this is a print kind of showing Reconstruction. You have like General Oliver Otis Howard, who's the head of the Freedmen's Bureau, Howard University in Washington, D.C. is named after him. He's kind of standing here mediating kind of like a conflict of the ex-rebels and the new freedmen communities. All right. So this is an announcement from the Intelligencer. It says, we learned from the Wheeling Intelligencer, actually another paper reprinting the Intelligencer, that Frederick Douglass, this gentleman, will probably lecture before the Library Association of that city at an early day. May we be there to hear him. So it's very nice that we're here at National Library Week talking about Frederick Douglass, because when he was invited to speak here in 1867, it was due to a literary library society. All right, so I don't know, Justin, maybe you want to read the right clip. You probably want to get up here so
Mike. Hello, everyone. All right. Frederick Douglass. We are pleased to announce that Frederick Douglass, the celebrated colored gentleman of that name, will deliver his address on the dangers of the Republic at Washington Hall on the evening of the 8th of April. Mr. Douglass is one of the best informed men of the country, white or colored, and has traveled, written, and spoken extensively in this country and in Europe. This address is instructive and interesting, not less from its subject matter and manner of treatment than from the native powers of its author and orator. We know that there are some conservative people who will turn up their noses at the idea of such a man speaking in our midst simply because his maker did not give him white skin. That is a matter which he could not control, for which it is both useless and unbecoming to apologize. Such as he is, he will speak for us, and we are glad to announce that fact, and also to assure him that he will be civilly received and respectfully heard. And this is the Dangers of the Republic speech. It's actually a lesser known speech, but it's a fascinating speech, and it kind of resonates today, where Douglass kind of talks about the dangers of anti-democratic authoritarianism. And yeah, that's a really good speech. I wish I had a little clip of it. All right, next slide. Next slide. This is Washington Hall. Frederick Douglass, the most distinguished man of the colored race and one of the first orators of the country. So this is just a little newspaper clipping, announcing Douglass's lecture and his presence here in Wheeling. Oh, this is nice. This is a bird's eye view of Wheeling, West Virginia, 1870, courtesy of the Library of Congress. There you can see the island. We got a chance to go past Wheeling Island today, and we saw the bridge. That bridge is wonderful. That suspension bridge, it's incredible.
We're gonna have to come back so we can drive over it. We
We couldn't drive over, but it was very nice. I got to touch it.
You're never gonna drive over.
Why's that?
It's closed.
For all time?
Well, looks that way.
How long has it been closed?
2 years. The state's going to rehab it and make a decision whether vehicles can ever use it again with a 5,000-pound weight limit.
Yeah.
And most cars today weigh over 5,000 pounds.
5,000.
Electric cars definitely weigh over 5,000 pounds. So you may be able to walk across it eventually after, $20 million or something? I forget how
About
much.
18 million, I think we saw there.
They
Federal
established
funds.
17 million in federal funds.
Yeah.
All right. Here we have a picture of two steamboats traveling on the water. Actually, one looks like it may be in tow. I'm not sure. It's just a nice little photo. Wheeling Wharf, historic marker for Wheeling Wharf. The Wheeling Wharf played a crucial role in bringing people and products to and from our growing city. The port has seen the arrival of visitors such as Lafayette, Meriwether Lewis, Mark Twain, and thousands of steamboat passengers, including one Frederick Douglass in 1867. The port was also the debarkation point for label cut nails, marsh stogies, male pouch tobacco. Oh, we saw that earlier. Picture of that. And a host of other famous Wheeling products. The Wheeling Wharf was the point around which the city grew and prospered. I have some nice historical markers in there. No reason why we can't get a historical marker out here for Douglass, right?
Right.
Here we have a picture of Douglass on the steamer. Refresh my memory on this one.
That is Douglass when he's on his way to Santo Domingo. So
This
that's
is the one on the way to Haiti.
Santo Domingo. That's 1871. Haiti's later.
Same island.
Same island.
It's the same island.
All right. Okay, yeah. So just now we'll switch back and forth a little bit. Okay, so we don't have an image capturing Douglass's arrival at the Wheeling Steamboat Wharf, but here this is actually kind of a little bit of a filtered photograph. But Douglass was pictured taking the steamboat over to Santo Domingo, which is on the Hispaniola, same island that Christopher Columbus, So anyway, so this is kind of nice. It just shows Mr. Douglass sitting with some other gentlemen. All right.
It's a nice photo.
So some of these are a little bit repetitive photographs, but this kind of shows the historic streetscape or kind of the landscape, the panoramic view of Wheeling, and you see kind of the steamboats arriving. There's some horses down there. It's obviously before someone mentioned electric cars, before Teslas or Model A's and Model T's. The horses were the main when they're grain and hay were the methods of fuel. All right. So this is another kind of just interesting print, kind of just showing Wheeling and kind of the steamboat traffic. And it actually took, I did not understand before looking into Douglass and Wheeling about how George Washington and other folks wanted to connect the Chesapeake Bay with the C&O Canal to the Ohio River, because if you connect it to the Ohio River, you can go all the way down to the Mississippi, down to New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. And so I don't know if anyone here has ever taken a steamboat from Wheeling down to New Orleans, but I understand that historically you used to be able to do that. All right, and so when Douglass comes to Wheeling in April of 1867, he's actually coming up the Ohio River from Marietta, Ohio, is where he was taking a steamboat from. All right, this is a nice little view from last night, kind of looking in the direction of which Mr. Douglass would have come from. Some more Steamboat Wharf photos, and as I understand, I know Shepherdstown claims that there was a steamboat or some sort of iteration of a steamboat launched in the late 1700s, but I also understand that Wheeling proudly claims its history as the the birthplace of the steamboat. I'm guessing the people here maybe are steamboat experts. So it's very, very interesting that the history of Wheeling is connected to steamboats, and when Frederick Douglass arrived, he took that historic conveyance. All right. Okay, so here is what you've waited for, the newspaper clips. Douglass, his lecture at Washington Hall last night, a large and brilliant audience and an excellent speech. According to announcement, Frederick Douglass delivered his lecture on the sources of danger to the Republic at Washington Hall last night. He was greeted with one of the largest and most intellectual audiences we have seen at the Hall since the previous gentleman, that's probably Schuyler Colfax, who was vice president under Graham. In fact, it has been very unusual for such a house to turn out on any occasion short of some very celebrated performance in an intellectual way. Mr. Douglass was introduced to the audience by Archibald W. Campbell of the Intelligencer, who on taking the stand, and then he says, so Mr. Campbell's introducing Douglass, and he says, I come before you tonight to introduce Mr. Frederick Douglass, a citizen of the state of New York. It is not necessary for me to inform this audience who he is, neither it is necessary for me to enter upon any vindication of his right to be here. And then the other clip is at the conclusion of the introduction, Mr. Douglass arose and before commencing was greeted with hearty demonstration of applause. After they had subsided, he took occasion to remark upon the gratification which has afforded him to appear before the Wheeling public, a city of which he had read and heard much, the capital of the young state of West Virginia, a product of the war for freedom and Republican government. So this kind of alludes to the fact that Douglass followed very closely the development of West Virginia as a state. He had not expected such a reception. He had supposed that the ancient prejudice against people of his color was still so strong as to limit him to a very meager hearing. But in Wheeling, you seem to be as free and generous and magnanimous as in Boston, and I'm proud to see and acknowledge the fact. At this hour, we have neither space nor time. So Douglass would sometimes go on for like 2 hours. So they essentially condensed his remarks. And just to the right, you'll see Mr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell purchased the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer in 1856, became its editor, and used the paper to express his abolitionist views. A staunch Unionist and early member of the Republican Party, he supported Abraham Lincoln for president. By 1861, Campbell was one of the most influential leaders in the West Virginia statehood movement. He served as Wheeling postmaster during the Civil War, and he was known as a militant, so naturally, therefore, he associated with Frederick Douglass. All right, this is a real, just quick note on his speech. So Douglass, like one of his go-to speeches was self-made men. He delivered that on over 200 different occasions. And that was kind of like a self-help inspirational talk. But when he's here in Wheeling, this is before, in 1867, before you have the passage of the 15th Amendment. So kind of the Reconstruction Acts are still legislatively moving through Congress. That's a little bit of context of Douglass's speech. And Andrew Johnson is still the president at this time. Sources of danger to the Republic is one of Douglass's greatest speeches. This is, I'm reading an excerpt from Robert Levin, who wrote this. Is one of Douglass's greatest speeches and deserves to be better known for its ruminations on the precarious state of democracy in post-Civil War America. Douglass delivered the speech in the midst of the battle over civil rights for Black people, addressing the threat posed to the nation by racist President Andrew Johnson, who refused to give them the full rights of citizenship. The sources of danger speech was prompted by the reactionary policies of Andrew Johnson, who assumed the presidency on April 15, 1965 after Lincoln's assassination. Shortly after taking office, Johnson pardoned former Confederate leaders and over the 4 years of his presidency vetoed all legislation that sought to expand the rights of Black Americans. In particular, Johnson opposed measures that granted Black Americans the right to vote. Convinced that Reconstruction was at a crossroads, Douglass composed Sources of Danger to the Republic during late 1866 and gave its first full presentation in January 1867 to a lecture series in Philadelphia. So basically, Douglass is kind of going after Andrew Johnson. And there's a new book out, actually, by the person who wrote this book about Douglass meets with Andrew Johnson in the White House in February 1866, and there's a new book out kind of about that meeting. All right, so just a quick little note on Mr. Douglass's travel itinerary. Still haven't really been able to figure out exactly if he was when he visits here in Wheeling, is he traveling eastward or westward? So according to an incomplete timeline of the travel itinerary and lecture schedule of Mr. Douglass, it would appear that the April 8 1867 lecture was delivered while en route westward to speaking engagements in Ohio, ? However, a newspaper report more than a dozen years later indicated Douglass was traveling eastward from Marietta, Ohio to Wheeling, then en route to Pittsburgh. The archival record indicates that in early 1867, Douglass spoke in Indiana, Missouri, Michigan, Iowa, and Minnesota as he moved east across the Midwest. In early April 1867, Douglass delivered a lecture in Cincinnati and then traveled northeasterly to Greenfield, Ohio. This would indicate that in the first 2 weeks of April 67, Douglass traveled from Ohio eastward to Wheeling and then returned westward to further speaking engagements in Ohio. A letter in the Belmont Chronicle, published in St. Clairsville, Ohio, indicates that Douglass delivered an impromptu lecture on April 12, 1867 in Bel Air, Ohio, while awaiting a westbound train, presumably for Columbus, Ohio, where Douglass was advertised to deliver a lecture April 13, 1867. All right. So the Mcclure House, Mr. Justin and I had a chance to visit the Mcclure House last night, and they advertised that they have good rates for monthly stays. The Mcclure Hotel opened its doors on the corner of Market and Monroe, which is now 12th Street in downtown Wheeling, March 4, 1852. I'm sure many people here know a lot more about the history of the Mcclure House than I, but it's interesting, whereas it talks on the website that kind of some of the famous people who stayed there, including Marilyn Monroe, presidents, but they don't list that. Douglass stayed there, in fact, in 1867 and 1884. All right, this is just another little, and a lot of these photos are from the Ohio County Public Library, digital collections, and archiving Wheeling. I'm sure many people have sifted through all of the online collections, but there's a lot of great material on the library's website. All right, this is a little post Douglass visiting, but this kind of shows the activity in the lobby of the hotel. All right, now this is it's kind of interesting. Please excuse the fact that it's a little blurry. It's pretty hard to scan a big sheet and then condense it down and crop it and all sorts of things. So I will just try to read this as best I can. This is pretty interesting. This is where in the 1884 Republican National Convention in Chicago, Mr. Campbell is a delegate from West Virginia, and he's essentially talking about how the Republican Party should not in any way be prejudiced towards Black Americans, and that Black Americans were important to the Republican Party. And he alludes to the fact that when Douglass visited Wheeling in 1867, that Mr. Campbell basically took it upon himself to host Mr. Douglass and make sure that he was given the proper accommodations. So this is then written from essentially a witness to Douglass's visit in 1867. This is written about a decade later. All right. So one of the flashes that aided in purifying the moral atmosphere which hung over the temporizing, filibustering crowd at Chicago Friday was an allusion by Mr. Campbell of West Virginia to his introduction of Frederick Douglass before a Wheeling audience just at the close of the war. The scene itself, in connection with attendant incidents, was of dramatic interest. A gentleman now connected with the Pioneer Free Press, who was the instrument of these incidents, thus relates them. So the gentleman is saying, while in college at Marietta, Ohio, one of my financial resources was a course of lectures for which I engaged Mr. Douglass, Mr. Henry Vincent, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and other distinguished men. I secured Mr. Douglass for a series of lectures at Greenfield, Athens, and Marietta, Ohio, Wheeling, and Pittsburgh. From Marietta to Wheeling, we traveled on a steamer well laden with the usual mixed crowd peculiar to an Ohio River steamer, many of whom told the captain that they wouldn't eat with no, I'm not going to, and it's a nice crowd. So basically a curse word and then a pejorative term. I kind of blanked that out. I quietly arranged for a private table at the head of the cabin, to which I invited Professor Evans, who at that time, Professor Evans was at Marietta College. He was one of the founding professors at Cornell in Ithaca, New York. A gentleman of high local distinction who, with myself, greatly enjoyed the table wit and wisdom of Mr. Douglass, while the crowd was aghast that the professor should prefer his company to theirs. Arriving at Wheeling, we went to the Mcclure House, the leading hotel, and I was assigned excellent rooms for Mr. Douglass and myself not long before the dinner hour. The hotel had been but the week before leased and occupied by a new proprietor, a Southerner, who had his reputation and capital invested in it. Before dinner, several hot-headed boarders waited on him and told him that if Douglas should be allowed the privilege of the dining room, they would leave the house. Mr. Douglas was ignorant and innocent of all trouble, as the arrangements were all mine. I listened incognito to the clamor around the landlord, edged my way through the crowd, and told Boniface that rather than involve him in loss, we would seek quarters elsewhere. He quietly motioned me to silence, saying, "No, young man, this is my house, and by God, I'll run it to suit myself. If these people want to leave, let them go." Subsequently, he himself conducted our party to the dining hall and to his own family table. I afterwards related the facts to Mr. Douglas, who said not a word in reply, but knit his lips with that intense expression peculiar to him in times of excitement. In my youthful indiscretion, it occurred to me to invite the governor of the state to introduce the lecture. Now, that would have been Governor Borman at the time. My modestly preferred request was declined with great politeness. I waited upon several gentlemen on the same errand, but met no encouragement. In despair, I went to the colored janitor of the hall and told him my story. His answer was, I'll just read. He says, "Well, sir, there's one," and this is written like phonetically. "Well, sir, there's one gentleman in Wheeling that isn't afraid," and then he uses a term which I won't repeat, "nor white folks shudder," and that's Mr. Campbell, who edits the Intelligencer. For those of you who can see the way it's written, you can see online, it's basically written. Okay, so that's it. I said, ran to Mr. Campbell, told him the whole story, frankly, and asked him to help me out. He assented quietly and unhesitatingly. As the audience gathered, I saw that the rear of the hall was filling with a class not unlikely seen at lectures. Later, a friend suggested to me quietly that I had better have a police force, as there were some present who might make trouble. Now, according to this recollection, Governor Arthur Borman then entered at that moment, and I asked his advice. He said there was no need of police. There might be some confusion, but no violent disturbance, to watch things and let him know if I saw anything worthy of cognizance. At the appointed time, Mr. Campbell and Mr. Douglas came before a crowded house. The latter took a seat, but the former advanced directly to the desk and in a few neat and incisive sentences introduced the lecturer. As the speaker rose in his splendid figure, his large head and wavy mass of hair erect, a slight hiss came from the crowd at the rear, followed immediately by moderate applause at the front. Then the hiss came more emphatically, and the applause responded with a roar. Hisses and a general murmur rolled toward the stage like a great wave, but were met and overborne by a roar of applause. And so for 2 or 3 minutes was kept up an internal antiphonal between enemies and friends of the great orator, until the audience having arisen, there came such a tempest of cheers, clapping of hands, and waving of hats as showed unmistakably that Mr. Douglas was in the house of his friends. The lecturer had stood unmoved and silent, bidding his time, and when the storm had passed, in that deep, pungent, musical voice which marked his best years and highest powers, he said with simple impressiveness, as near I can remember, "Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of West Virginia, I have come to speak to you tonight concerning certain dangers to the Republic. Let me, as a personal word, say that whatever may come of this day and night, I bid you see to it that man," pointing towards the hotel, "whose bread I have just shared shall not be harmed by a prejudice which all in good time shall cease upon earth." End quote. Thence he went forward with a 2 hours address of great power, undisturbed throughout, and heartily congratulated at the end. All right, so that's a pretty nice anecdote and essentially contemporary account of Douglas's first lecture here in Wheeling. Yes, ma'am, I see a question.
So then Borman did come to hear him speak.
Well, I will say that further investigation is probably needed to confirm that. But by this account, which with oral histories, I know myself, I could say something happened 2 years ago, really happened 5 years ago, or I think someone was at this event and they were really at a different event. So this is essentially a recollection about 15 years after. But the way that the story is told would appear that maybe Mr. Borman, because Borman would have been, with Wheeling being the capital until the mid-1880s, Borman would have been here in Wheeling, and maybe he said he couldn't come, and then his schedule freed up, and then he decided to come to the lecture hall. I would say I will put about 75% possibility that Borman did attend this. I haven't found other sources to collaborate this, or the contemporary reports of Douglass don't mention Borman. This is the one that mentions him being there. But Douglass did share a stage with Borman in 1873, and so they obviously, or I would be led to believe that they had a prior relationship.
Thank
You're welcome. Thank you for the question. All right, so these are just some photos of the Mcclure Hotel, and these are from the Ohio County Public Library Archives. All right. Okay, this is interesting. Maybe Justin, you want to? I guess let's go. All right, so this is a ghost visit that Frederick Douglass was announced to make, but in fact did not make. All right. We are informed last evening that arrangements had been perfected to have short addresses one evening next week in Washington Hall by Fred Douglass, Major General Delaney, who's from Jefferson County, West Virginia, and John Mercer Langston. The two last named have been heard from and have promised to be present. General Delaney is the only colored man who has ever risen to that position in the country, and during the rebellion, he was in South Carolina. All right, so this was a newspaper announcement that there would be a laying of a African Methodist Episcopal Church cornerstone, grand demonstration, Frederick Douglass, John Mercer Langston, and Martin Delaney. It appears that Douglass was, maybe he missed his connecting train or he had family obligation, but it doesn't appear that he was able to come to this event in 1869, but possibly due to the positive reception he received in 1867, he was willing to make another visit to Wheeling. All right, this just is laying of the cornerstone. And so there was a lot of anticipation of Frederick Douglass visiting, but I don't believe he was able to make this visit. All right, so Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman. We went past the church last night. I don't know if it's still referred to as Wayman Chapel. The cornerstone on the church says Wayman Chapel. Wayman Chapel's namesake is Bishop Alexander Walker Wayman. Born free in Caroline County on Maryland's Eastern Shore, Bishop Wayman's parents were friendly with the parents of Anna Murray, the wife of Frederick Douglass, babysat a young Bishop Wayman. Leaving the Eastern Shore for Baltimore in the early 1840s, Wayman became involved with the growing African Methodist Episcopal Church, formerly founded in 1816 in Philadelphia by Richard Allen. Bishop Wayman was a frequent presence in communities of Western Maryland, West Virginia, and throughout the Mountain South and Appalachian diaspora, helping to establish the AME Church in new communities following the Civil War. He traveled extensively throughout the railroads and stagecoach lines, and Bishop Wayman eulogized Frederick Douglass in Washington, D.C. in February 1895. All right. In December 79, Bishop Wayman traveled to Wheeling to dedicate a new AME church, first taking the name of Wayman Chapel, then Wayman AME Church, which still worships, as I understand, right around the corner from here. In Wayman's 1882 autobiography, he mentions visiting Wheeling on several occasions, as well as Parkersburg, in service of the growth of the AME Church. All right, and that is from last night, and that cornerstone says Wayman Chapel. All right, in February 1882, the Wheeling Intelligencer ran an editorial in response to reports of discrimination that the Fisk Jubilee singers had faced during a tour of New York City. The Intelligencer editorialized in favor of, quote, fair treatment in public accommodations, referencing the hospitality shown to both Frederick Douglass and the Jubilee singers while in Wheeling. Just read the opening line here. It can be said for Wheeling that on the occasion of the visit of the Fisk singers to the city some years ago, they were hospitably entertained at the leading hotel of the city, as was Frederick Douglass on a previous occasion. The Fisk Jubilee singers were out of Nashville at Fisk University, and Frederick Douglass had supported the Fisk Jubilee singers and spoke at Fisk. And then the last sentence you'll see, the time will come when all respectable colored people will get fair treatment on board every conveyance and at every hotel in the land. All right, so this is the second known visit of Mr. Frederick Douglass to the great city of Wheeling. So this is the Opera House, Honorable Frederick Douglass. You can see in the photo, he's aged a little bit because it was almost 20 years since he had first visited Wheeling. and ticket was 50 cents. All right, and so he spoke at, I guess it's Lacana Building, right there at 12th and Market Street. And it's just another, just changing newspaper announcement. All right, built on the site of the original Washington Hall, a second Washington Hall, which also housed the Ground Opera House, was built in 1877. Many of you know this history, so I'll just fast forward. Other than Frederick Douglass spoke on this site in 1867 and 1884, and maybe we can get a Civil War trail sign, a Wheeling National Heritage Area sign. I don't know, maybe a statue for Frederick Douglass. I offer the first $10 to support the statue of Douglass going there. All right. Okay, this is a photo taken from last night. So on the top is kind of a photo of Douglass around 1867. On the bottom is what Douglass would have looked like around 1884. So you can see kind of his salt and pepper hair went from salt and pepper to kind of snowy white. All right. Okay, this is another newspaper clip that's a little difficult to read, so please bear with me. All right, Emancipation Day. So when Douglass comes in 1884, he takes the train to Martin's Ferry. He stays the night in Martin's Ferry. He wakes up. He addresses a group in Martin's Ferry that had a high concentration of, I guess, Wheelingites is the appropriate term. I say Wheelingtonians, but Wheelingites, Wheelingtonians. So when Douglass is in Martin's Ferry in early September, in the early part of September 22, he's in Martin's Ferry. He then gives his address and then crosses the Ohio River into Wheeling, where he gives a evening address at the Opera House and then has dinner at a private home in Wheeling. So I will try to read this as best I can. Emancipation Day observed at Martin's Ferry yesterday in a becoming manner by the colored citizens of Eastern Ohio, an oration by Frederick Douglass and other appropriate exercises. The Emancipation celebration at Martin's Ferry yesterday was a notable success in all respects. In the forenoon, a procession took place. Uniformed clubs of colored men and others from Bel Air, Steubenville, Bridgeport, Martin's Ferry, Wheeling, and elsewhere taking part. The club from Mount Pleasant was mounted, and there were many wagons and carriages in the procession. In the afternoon, a meeting was held in Walnut Grove, which was well attended. There were probably 1,500 people present, about evenly divided between the two races. Many of the most prominent professional men of Belmont County were attentive listeners to the address by Mr. Douglass. Professor James H. Jones of the colored schools of this city was chosen chairman, and this is from the Wheeling Intelligencer. He introduced Miss Annie Gardner, a pupil of his school who had been selected to read the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln. Miss Gardner is a bright and attractive little lady and read the document clearly and well. Mr. Frederick Douglass, the famous colored orator and author, was then introduced and greeted with cheers. All right, so the remarks that Douglass is giving are essentially discussing the Emancipation Proclamation and its impact on the outcome of the Civil War. He alluded to his relationship and friendship with President Lincoln. This is also just several weeks before the election of 1884, in which Republican candidate James Blaine was opposing Democrat Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland would end up winning the 1884 election. He was the first Democrat to win the presidency since James Buchanan in 1856. So Douglass's remarks in 1884 are also kind of tinged a little bit with political stumping and helping to activate Republican Party networks in West Virginia and Ohio. All right, and interestingly enough, there was a the former governor and United States Senator of Arkansas, Powell Clayton, was on stage. Why General from Arkansas was here, I don't know, but he was there on stage. All right, these are some prints of an Emancipation Day event in actually Charleston, South Carolina, but it kind of just recreates what you'd have an elevated stage and a platform, and the orators would speak to help amplify their voices. And they have a large crowd with different veterans-oriented groups, benevolent associations, church groups, schools, and the images on the right are from different Emancipation Days over the year. These are unfortunately not from Wheeling, from other areas, but you show kind of the the street activity and the enthusiasm in the community at these events. And in the middle image, there's a gentleman in the front of the procession on a horse. All right. So this is an interesting gentleman who was as I understand, the first black member of the Wheeling City Council. And this is a newspaper clip from on the left, my left, your right. Emancipation Day, a mild observance by Wheeling's colored people and a better one by Martin's Ferry. Honorable Frederick Douglass, the orator of both places, what he talked about. Yesterday was the anniversary of the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation and was mildly celebrated in Wheeling by a speech from Honorable Frederick Douglass, the well-known colored orator. Now, unfortunately, some of the newspaper reporting was not as favorable to the turnout at Wheeling in 1884. The Democratic papers would usually underestimate the crowd. The Republican papers sometimes would overestimate the crowds. So yeah. All right. So it says, as he was speaking in Martin's Ferry in the afternoon, Mr. George Welcome and BHilliard conveyed the steering of Douglass over the river here to Wheeling and introduced him at his lecture at the Opera House. A very meager audience paid the 50 cents admission fee to hear him. 100 persons in the proportion of 10 colored to 1 white made up the audience. Mr. Douglass was introduced by Dr. BHilliard and made an address of about 2 hours duration. Since his last visit to Wheeling, he has changed but little except to grow older. And this gentleman featured in the middle was the subject of a very, very nice article archiving Wheeling, talked about Mr. Hilliard and his connections to Wheeling as a doctor, as well as kind of local politics. Boswell Henson Hilliard was born January 1847 in Port Tobacco, Maryland, which is kind of in southern Maryland. He attended the medical department at Union College in Albany, New York, in late 1879 to 1881, and then Howard University. He was licensed to practice medicine in 1882 by the West Virginia State Board. And he lived on, I believe is it Eoff Street? Oh, okay. Oak Street. Oh, not Eoff. Okay. Oh. All right. Thank you for the correction in unison. All right, so he lived on Off Street and I guess that sounds kind of impolite to say oaf, like oaf. Okay, so he lived on Oak Street, and as my understanding, so this is a historic photo of where he lived on Oak Street, and we drove up Oak Street today, and on one side, I believe it's Old Simpson Methodist Episcopal Church, and then Wayman Chapel. So on one side of the street, and on the other side, I believe is where Mr. Hilliard lived, but I don't believe his home is still standing. Some may correct me. All right, this is kind of an interesting discursive possible connection to Mr. Douglass. Moses Viney escaped slavery from Talbot County, Maryland, and served as a valet and coachman for President Knott of Union College from the 1840s until mid-1860s. Afterwards, Viney ran a coach business in the area of Albany, New York, and Schenectady, and was a prominent leader within the area's Black community. Did Mr. Hilliard know Viney? We believe it highly likely because Mr. Viney would have been in and around basically driving the Ubers or the Lyfts or the cabs around Albany when Mr. Hilliard was in the medical college there. All right, and Frederick Douglass served on the board of trustees of Howard University in Washington from 1872 until his death in 1895. Here is a clip from, I believe this is, I don't have the exact year of this clipping, but this is from the catalog of Howard University. You can see underlined on your left-hand side is Honorable Frederick Douglass on the board of trustees, and then they have his name is Basil. And he's delineated as being from Albany, New York. That's probably because he was most recently at Union College. He believe he first was at Howard University, then goes to Union College, and then comes back to Howard University's medical college. So this shows that Douglass was a frequent attendee of graduations, orientations, campus events, alumni events, speakers at Howard University. It's very highly believed that Douglass knew Mr. Hilliard in advance of them sharing the stage here in Wheeling in 1884. All right, Explains a little bit about that. Dr. Boswell Henson Stilliard, born in Southern Maryland in 1847, was educated at Howard University's medical school in the 1876-1877 term, then attended Union College's medical department in Albany, New York, and then returned to Howard's medical school for the 1881-1882 term. During Stilliard's studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C., Frederick Douglass was an active member of the university's board of trustees. Douglass was known not only as a frequent attendee of university functions on and off campus, such as guest lectures, orientations, rhetorical and musical exercises, commencement and alumni gatherings, but he also frequently invited and hosted Howard University students at his home. So it is possible for the Monday night literary club, or a gathering of students at Howard University that would happen usually on Sundays at Cedar Hill when they would discuss politics and play music and discuss Shakespeare. It's possibly that Mr. Stilliard went to Douglass's home and kind of shared social company with him. All right. We do not know the extent of the relationship and connections between Douglass and Stilliard through Howard University, but it is within reason and highly possible they made each other's acquaintance either on campus or within the DC community as well. Dr. Charles Purvis, one of Stilliard's instructors at Howard, was a close friend of Douglass as well as other university medical school faculty. Records indicate that as a student, Stilliard was active within the community in both Albany, New York, and Washington. The 1877 DC City Directory enumerates Stilliard as living at 326 D Street Southeast with possibly his brother or family member Daniel Stilliard, while an 1882 newspaper account indicates Stilliard was elected chairman during a mass meeting of the colored people of South Washington in response to the recent Emancipation Day festivities in DC. So Stilliard was probably involved in Emancipation Day activities in Washington, D.C. while he was a student at Howard University, and then he's involved with the Emancipation Day celebration in 1884 here in Wheeling. All right, these are some images of Howard University's medical school and faculty, which we will fast forward in the interest of time, but the gentleman on your bottom right would have been some of Dr. Stilliard's instructors, and Douglass knew all of these gentlemen well. All right, on stage with Mr. Douglass in in Martins Ferry in 1884 were ex-Arkansas Governor and United States Senator Clayton Powell and Professor James McHenry Jones, who has been featured on the Archiving Wheeling sites on a couple different destinations. All right, Professor James McHenry Jones on stage with Mr. Douglass. I will take a break and turn it over to my colleague here, Mr. McNeil.
Professor James McHenry Jones on stage with Frederick Douglass in 1884. Jones made his mark as an educator at the Lincoln Common School in Wheeling, founded in 1866 to educate Black children, and as the third principal of the West Virginia Colored Institute, today West Virginia State University, located near Charleston from 1898 to 1909. At Lincoln from 1882 to 1889, Jones doubled the number of teachers and students, broadened the curriculum, and rebuilt the school after a fire in 1892. At the Colored Institute, he increased federal and state funding, built classrooms, dormitory, and shop buildings, and broadened the curriculum to include teacher and military training programs. Students spent half of their time on academic studies and the other half in the trades, building and learning various manual and industrial skills. At the time of the Emancipation Day Parade in September 1884, J.M. Jones was serving as principal of the Lincoln School in Wheeling. Jones will serve as chairman for the Emancipation Day visit on Frederick Douglass's visit in 1884 and the Emancipation Day visit of former U.S. Senator from Mississippi, Bruce K. Blanche, to Wheeling in 1891-1896. Professor James of the Color School of this city was chosen chairman. He introduced Miss Annie Gardner, a small pupil of the school who had been selected to read the Emancipation Proclamation. Miss Gardner is a bright and attractive little lady and read the document clearly and well. And that is from the Wheeling Daily Intelligencer, September 23, 1884. Okay, here we have a picture of the Lincoln School. We passed it. It is in bad shape. Nature's kind of reclaimed that.
Yeah, we drove past it the other day. We could see the Lincoln within the.
Yeah, we did. All right, locations of Lincoln School in Wheeling, 1866 to 1874, the south side of St. Charles Street, between 5th, which is currently Oath and 6th. Jacob, I was really struggling with it. It's like, I gotta get this right.
The E is silent.
I think Siri might say EO. So
The E is silent.
we gotta take that up with Apple.
That's how we tell you're at the 10.
Okay, yeah. See? It was a setup. It was a setup. So 1875 to 1829, it was at 10th and Chaplin. And from 1829 to 1943, it was at 1000 Chaplin Street. 1943 to present, it is currently at 1000 Chaplin Street. School now closed. Now the Ronald C. Mulholland Juvenile Center. I don't think it's anything now, right? All right, that's a nice photo. Nice kids out there looking bright and shiny, faces all greased up. All right, is Annie Gardner in this picture? This is Lincoln School, 1880s. Among the first public schools established for African Americans students in the United States, Wheeling's Lincoln School was founded in 1866. We don't know if we have.
So just as a brief note, so this photo comes from the library's archives. Sean may know more about this photograph, but it's undated just to say the 1880s. So Douglas is here in 1884. They say that Annie Gardner, I don't know if there's any maybe members of her family here, but they say Annie Gardner read the Emancipation Proclamation. We don't know if one of these students may be Annie Gardner, but they look like some very confident, precocious, intelligent young little ladies.
It is in the realm of possibility that one of these capricious young children could be Annie Gardner. Okay, J.R. Clifford, Emancipation Day. This is a clip. You want to get? Yeah. All right, you get.
All right, so.
All right.
Okay, so some of the.
Excuse me. All right. So,
yes. Some of the methodology and techniques of our presentation is throwing history up against the wall and seeing what sticks. So a lot of this is kind of the connections and relationships and overlapping degrees of separation. So here is another newspaper clip, Emancipation Day, and okay, actually, I'm sorry. This is reiterating the, I think this is the same newspaper clip from earlier, but I underlined George Welcome. All right, now George Welcome is an interesting gentleman who I haven't really been able to determine a great deal about him, but he was from Martinsburg, West Virginia. He was connected to Wheeling, West Virginia, connected to Grafton, and he shared the stage with Douglass here in 1884, which, according to some sources, said he couldn't have been much more than 25 years old. And so was trying to determine how Mr. Welcome knew Douglass. And this is an obituary for George Welcome. This is from the early 1890s. George Welcome killed a young colored man well known in the city. Now, this is from this is from a newspaper out of Wheeling. Well known in this city, being Wheeling, was among those killed in the big wreck of the Pittsburgh division of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. He was a printer by trade and started the Pioneer Press, a local newspaper now owned by J.R. Clifford. For some years, he had been living in Wheeling, but a short time ago had concluded to return to Martinsburg as early as possible to make his future home. When killed, he was returning to Wheeling from a visit to his mother in the city, that's Martinsburg. He was married about 30 years, and he was aged about 30 years and was unmarried. All right. So John Robert Clifford, who was a pioneering lawyer, educator, connected to several different communities in West Virginia. He's usually credited as starting the Pioneer Press in Martinsburg in 1884. There is ample evidence to demonstrate that George Welcome was the founder of the Pioneer Press in 1883, and then J.R. Clifford, in fact, basically bought him out of his ownership stake in the newspaper. So somehow, some way, George Welcome knew Douglass prior to his speech here in Wheeling, because Douglass usually did not share the stage with people he did not know. And I think it's very interesting that Mr. Welcome, probably in his mid-20s, is sharing the stage with Douglass, because Douglass is, in many popular media, is depicted as being very stoic or almost selfish, and other not very good characteristics, and that's actually the farthest thing from the truth. He was very benevolent, very philanthropic, and he really did a lot to reach out and mentor the younger generation of activists. Some may have heard of Ida B. Wells. Douglass took a very active role in mentoring Ida B. Wells and other activists. All right. So the Pioneer Press was connected here to Wheeling. It says on the bottom here, you'll see Reverend J.W. Hollinger of Wheeling is an assistant editor. The Pioneer Press is the title of a paper originally started by George Welcome, a young colored man of this town who learned the printing business at Cleveland, Ohio. He was disposed of all interest in the paper to Professor Clifford, who we have no doubt will conduct it with ability, fairness, and propriety. All right, so Mr. Clifford is pictured in the top, I believe your top left, with W.E.B. Du Bois. Clifford was one of the organizers of the Niagara movement that met in Harper's Ferry, the campus of Storr College in the early 1900s. All right. The background of George Washington Welcome remains rather unknown or rather unconfirmed. By various accounts, he was a colored barber in Ohio in the early 1890s after having been a teacher in Martinsburg in the late 1870s, and he was a land investor and speculator in the, quote, unbroken wilderness of Grant County due to abounding iron ore. If he was born in 1864, as several sources would indicate, he would have been only 20 years old at the time of Douglass's visit to Wheeling. That such a young man shared the stage with Douglass was not uncommon, but it is nonetheless notable and exceptional. According to several sources, in May of 1883, Welcome began the Pioneer Press, a monthly journal in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Welcome was reportedly an advocate for the Republican ticket. Welcome was noted as a prominent citizen and an advocate for the candidacy of John A. Logan in the 1884 presidential campaign at conventions held in the state's eastern panhandle. It is possible that Welcome met Frederick Douglass during his visit and lecture in Martinsburg in 1879. So Welcome is probably about 15, 16 years old when Douglass spoke in Martinsburg, and possibly they maintained some sort of correspondence. So a lot of these are open-ended questions, and I see this young man in the front taking dutiful notes. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some of these open-ended questions before the end of the presentation. All right. If you can hear me, clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. All right, just trying to keep everyone alive or lively. Okay, wonderful. All right, so we're rounding an hour. We got about 10 to 15 more minutes. Well, we only have a couple more slides. We're almost at the end. All right, so this is kind of interesting. Now, so this was not on Oak Street. This was on Byron Street. I believe that's how you pronounce it, right, Byron? Okay, all right, sorry. Following the address at the Opera House at 12th and Market Street, Frederick Douglass presumably went to his lodging at the Mcclure House and then across the street before walking a couple blocks up 12th Street to nearby Byron Street in East Wheeling, where he was hosted, quote, by about 20 of the aristocracy of the colored people of Wheeling. I'll just read this newspaper clip. A banquet to Douglass. After the lecture last evening, Honorable Frederick Douglass was tendered a banquet by a number of his colored friends at the house of Miss Elizabeth Jackson, where about 20 of the aristocracy of the colored people of Wheeling assembled. Miss Jackson had spread a tempting supper in honor of the distinguished guest, to which all present did full justice. And so this mentions several individuals. Some notable attendees were Dr. Stilliard, Professor Jones, and George W. Welcome, Henry Boose Clemens, who has also been featured on Archiving Wheeling, attended, as well as George W. Hollinger, who was the assistant editor of the Pioneer Press and was essentially the Wheeling correspondent. All right, these leading Black Wheelingtonians and Wheelingites and their families, as well as progressive white Wheelingtonians and Wheelingites, would also coordinate the invitations and arrange the host committees for the subsequent visits of former United States Senator Blanche Bruce to Wheeling at Emancipation Day Parade in 1891, and former United States Congressman John R. Lynch to an Emancipation Day Parade here in Wheeling in 1896. So these individuals hosted and organized prominent national speakers coming to Wheeling to visit and speak at the Emancipation Day parades. And Douglass had a very close relationship with Senator Bruce and Congressman Lynch. Douglass actually met with President Benjamin Harrison in the White House with Mr. Lynch in the 1890s. All right. So Frederick Douglass on the West Virginia rails. Frederick Douglass traveled extensively throughout the eastern seaboard and Midwest on various railroad lines before and after the Civil War. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad was one of the lines he most frequently traveled due to its connecting 13 states and D.C. to the nation, as well as its non-discriminatory policies and prevalence of Black support staff on rail cars, rail stations, and hotels. So the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, if Douglass bought a first-class business class ticket, he was confident and knew that he would be seated in the first class accommodations no matter wherever the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad traveled. Some of the railroads in the southern states were not as friendly to Mr. Douglass. Douglass used humor in many different occasions. I'll tell a little Frederick Douglass joke just because you guys look like you might like a joke. This is not related to Wheeling in any way, but nonetheless, please bear with me. All right, so Douglass is in Wisconsin, and he's giving an address later that night, and he wants to eat in the main dining hall, and the owner says, basically, we're not going to serve you. You can get your meal in the bar. So there's all these dirty, rotten scoundrels, kind of scraggle-toothed ruffians, spitting tobacco on the floor, cursing. And so Douglass is not very comfortable. So he says very loudly, says, it's very interesting to learn that the horses in this town have more humanity than the people. For outside, I saw a white horse and a black horse drinking from the same trough. Basically said that the people can learn a lot from the horses. So then basically the proprietor heard the commotion, and came over and said, what's the matter? And they repeated the joke. And the owner said, I'm sorry, Mr. Douglass. I didn't know who you were. I apologize for this indignity that has been delivered upon you here. Let me see you to the main dining hall. All right. So, yes. In 1879, following the Civil War, Douglass began traveling the railroads into Virginia and the newly created West Virginia. For the last 30 years of his life, Douglass spoke extensively in areas of Western Maryland, West Virginia, and Western Pennsylvania. In 1879, for example, Douglass spoke in Martinsburg in Berkeley County via the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. For those of you familiar with Martinsburg, the train station depot is still there. Later in the year, in 1879, Douglass spoke in Cumberland and arrived in town via the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad and stayed at the Queen City Hotel, for those of you who are historians of the old railroad hotels. Additionally, when Douglass traveled to Harper's Ferry in Jefferson County, Douglass traveled via the B&O Railroad. In October 1884, following his visit to Wheeling, Douglass was in Grafton in Taylor County, West Virginia, awaiting the connecting train to Cincinnati, which I'll allude to that in just a moment. So this is an interesting clip to your left. It says that this is from a newspaper journalist. He said, we boarded the train last Tuesday, not for the purpose of interviewing the noted colored marshal of the District of Columbia, Mr. Fred Douglass, who was on board en route to Staunton, Virginia, as the Free Press would infer, but for the purposes of a business trip to Winchester. Not knowing previously that Mr. Douglass was on board, we were pleased, however, to meet with him and can say that we found him to possess many admirable traits of character, being especially noted for his frankness and courteousness, of which we regret to have to state we cannot accuse all our neighbors of the newspaper fraternity. All right. So these are some different B&O railroad stations. Some of yesteryear, some are still standing. To your left, that is the I believe the community college campus. That is not the Baltimore Ohio Railroad station that Douglass would have come in on, but that's nonetheless a historic railroad station. And then you'll see in the middle is a long train schedule, and then magnified is a train schedule that denotes the trains leaving from New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and when they arrive in Wheeling, and then when they go from Wheeling to Bel Air and then to Grafton, down to Cumberland, and vice versa. I believe the last passenger train left Wheeling, I think, is 1961. 1961, I think, like in Oakland, Maryland, I think it's like in the 70s. So the passenger, Harper's Ferry still has the MARC train services Martinsburg and Harper's Ferry and goes down to Union Station in Washington, D.C. For any of you who've taken those trains. All right. Okay, this is kind of interesting. So Frederick Douglass at Grafton in October 1884, while citizens of Grafton were anticipating the arrival of Republican vice presidential nominee John Logan, were awaiting his special train, there was an incident which which relieved the tedium of the long wait, reported a special dispatch from Grafton to the Wheeling Intelligencer. Although apparently unscheduled, Frederick Douglass, a frequent presence in West Virginia following the Civil War, would be called on to stump in favor of the ticket of Blaine and Logan from the back of a Baltimore and Ohio rail car in Grafton after arriving in town en route westward to Cincinnati. This public appearance of Douglass, although unprompted, was less than a month after he had spoken in Wheeling as part of an Emancipation Day parade. When Douglass's presence became known around the rail yard and word spread within town, Douglass was, quote, loudly cheered. However, Douglass declined to speak to the crowd until he had received his supper. Once nourished, Douglass was introduced to the crowd by former Union governor of wartime and restored Virginia, Francis Harrison Pierpont, who I know has a prominent statue here in Wheeling. Very appropriately, a native of Marion County, West Virginia, Pierpont was raised in an anti-slavery household and was known to have strong abolitionist sentiments. Standing on the platform of the rail car, Douglass reportedly made a speech working the crowd up to greater enthusiasm for Blaine and Logan. So Douglass was a very loyal Republican. He attended national conventions. He was involved in, he would speak on behalf of congressional candidates, senators, governors. So when Douglass is in Grafton, he's kind of called out to make a speech in favor of the Republican ticket. And so this is just a small little dispatch. And you can see Mr. Douglass's name is underlined in red. All right. So West Virginia's founding fathers, Governor Francis Pierpont and Governor Arthur Borman and Frederick Douglass. We know on at least one occasion, Frederick Douglass and Mr. Borman shared the same stage in Parkersburg in 1873. In Grafton in 1884, Mr. Pierpont gave brief introductory remarks to a crowd before Mr. Douglass spoke. And there is some evidence that Mr. Borman attended Frederick Douglass's lecture here in Wheeling in 1867, but that is yet to be entirely confirmed. So it's kind of interesting history that I understand there may be a statue coming to Wheeling for Mr. Borman. So maybe we could do like a trinity of Mr. Borman, Mr. Douglass, and Mr. Pierpont. That would kind of be very, you like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, like I said, I got $10 in my pocket. It's burning a hole in my pocket to donate to the All right, we're almost done, everybody. You guys have been a great crowd, great audience. Listen to, I see you taking furious notes. All right, so this letter is addressed to Frederick Douglass from H.W. Rolls of an Oddfellows Lodge from Bel Air, Ohio, from late July 1894, concerning a potential lecture by Douglass in Bel Air in the fall of that year. So it is possible that Douglass made another public speech in Wheeling. I'm not really sure. When Douglass is in Grafton, he's waiting for his connecting train to Cincinnati. I believe he's probably taking the train maybe from Washington all the way up past Cumberland, and he would have passed through Wheeling, but he wouldn't have gotten off the car. He would have just stayed on the train reading, the New York Tribune or another paper. It is not known if Douglass delivered this planned address in Bel Air, which is about 6 miles south of Wheeling on the Ohio River in the fall of 1894, but records indicate Douglass did not make this engagement. This could be for a number of reasons, including health, family emergencies, or one of the death of his friends. Because when Douglass was an older gentleman, he said he was essentially tired of attending funerals of all his old friends like William Lloyd Garrison, John Greenleaf Whittier, and others. Wendell Phillips. At this moment in his public career, Douglass was regularly delivering a speech entitled Lessons of the Hour, which addressed the issues of Southern outrages known as lynchings or extrajudicial killings in today's nomenclature. It is possible that Douglass made an additional private and or public visit to Wheeling. I believe it is possible, and the research continues. All right, and just as a little nod to West Virginia, Dr. Carter G. Woodson is the genesis or the creator of Negro History Week, which was started in February because Frederick Douglass's birthday is in February, Abraham Lincoln's birthday is in February, and Negro History Week has become Black History Month, which is the most robust public history celebration kind of in America. I mean, there's some may say Women's History Month. I don't want to argue. Women's History Month and Black History Month are both very robust public celebrations, and Douglass also has a place with the women historians because he's a very active suffragist and womanist. But nonetheless, I think this is interesting that Dr. Carter Woodson is from West Virginia, or connected to West Virginia, started Black History Month, which was in honor of Frederick Douglass. And to your right, my left, is a statue of Dr. Woodson on 9th Street in Washington, D.C. in the Shaw neighborhood. Dr. Woodson lived in the Shaw neighborhood for about 50 years. And then on your left is this, on your right is a statue of Dr. Woodson in Huntington. And I believe that concludes our remarks. We'd like to thank several individuals and institutions, and we'd like to thank the audience. And if you guys have any questions, just shoot your hands up.
Thank you.
I have one question.
Yes.
I remember reading several years ago some book about Frederick Douglass, and they said that he was the most photographed person in the world during his lifetime. Have you ever run across a reference similar to that?
Yes. There were two actually European-based historians. They are out of the continent of Europe, and they did a book called Picturing Frederick Douglass that, believe the way they say, is that Douglass was the most photographed American during his lifespan. Douglass was born in 1818. He dies in 1895. So during that period of time, Douglass is photographed more than Abraham Lincoln, more than Mark Twain. Mark Twain had a lot of photographs, but those were when he's in his white suit that premiered in 1907. More so than, I guess, Emily Dick, or not Emily Dick. There were, I'm trying to think, the lady was photographed often. Queen Victoria. So Douglass during his life was the most photographed American of his time. There are, I believe, about 160 known photographs of Douglass. These are either he's standing or sitting for a portrait by like Matthew Brady in Washington, or when he would visit towns who frequently sit for a photograph. There's a photograph of Douglass at, he's in the crowd at Lincoln's second inaugural address. There's a couple other photos where he's kind of like in a crowd or in a group. I believe the number of photographs of Douglass could probably be maybe double that. I think there's a lot of I don't know that a photograph of the members of the Board of Trustees has ever surfaced. There had to have been a photograph of the Board of Trustees because there were photos of the medical faculty. When Douglass is United States Marshal of the District from 1877 to 1881, most likely he was photographed. Maybe there's a photo somewhere of Douglass in Wheeling, West Virginia. I don't know if anyone has like an attic where you have old photographs, or it's quite possible maybe there's a photo. There's a couple of photographs of Douglass giving speeches. There's one that was taken in the 1890s where he's at Tuskegee. There's like American flag bunting. But yes, he was the most photographed. I guess he's the most photographed American of they say, I guess, of the 19th century. A great question.
I'm not sure about this. Was Douglass's freedom bought by some English ladies? What date was that freedom bought?
That's a wonderful question. The question was Frederick Douglass's freedom purchased by English ladies? And yes, when Douglass writes his first autobiography it's published in May of 1845. And when it is published, Douglass is essentially incriminating himself. He's giving the details of his life essentially as a fugitive slave. He names Edward Lloyd V. He names people on the Eastern Shore. He gives, essentially, the term would be like he snitches on himself, or he's telling on himself. Yeah, he tells on himself. So he gives basically all the details for people to confirm his identity. So when Douglass is doing this, he's still legally a fugitive slave. And this is before the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that gave United States Marshals the ability to cross state boundaries. So in 1845, it's like a state issue. So Massachusetts was essentially like a sanctuary state.
So in 1845.
So in 1845, when Douglass writes this autobiography, people essentially tell him, "Hey, Fred, you kind of put your freedom at jeopardy because someone could seize you in the middle of the night. You travel to Ohio, Indiana, someone could seize you, bring you back to Maryland, and basically sell you all sorts of things." So Douglass goes to Ireland, Scotland, and England, and he speaks on the abolitionist circuit in Europe. And in You asked the exact, like the date of when his freedom is purchased, or when it's like he gets like his freedom papers. I don't know the exact date, other than by late 1846, early 1847, money is raised and there's correspondence between the Auld family, who the Auld family was like the legal owner of Frederick Douglass. And so there's correspondence going back and forth between the Atlantic Ocean. So before we had emails. And so the purchase, I guess like the price is agreed on, I believe it was about $750. And so the English ladies or the English abolitionists, kind of like the anti-slavery society of like London women, or I forget the exact title, but essentially they then send the money. There's before we had Western Union or other methods. So the money is sent across the Atlantic Ocean, and Douglass's freedom papers are filed in Baltimore County, Maryland. And this is probably like the summer of 1847. Douglass then returns to the United States, and he settles in Rochester, New York, and launches the North Star newspaper in December of 1847.
Well, basically, he was a young man when he first was born.
When Douglass's freedom is born, when Frederick Douglass's freedom is purchased, Douglass thought he was born in 1817, but he was actually born in 1818. So Douglass is about 29, 30 years old when his freedom is purchased, or when he's legally a freedman. I see a hand in the back.
How much influence did Douglass have with President Lincoln?
The question was, how much input did Frederick Douglass have with Abraham Lincoln? That is a wonderful question. Frederick Douglass meets with Abraham Lincoln for the first time in the summer of 1863. When Douglass meets with Lincoln in 1863, it is following the Battle of Fort Wagner. I don't know, has anyone seen the movie Glory? Okay, so the movie Glory, Frederick Douglass's eldest son, Lewis Henry Douglass, was a sergeant in the Massachusetts 54 Volunteer Infantry. And so after the Battle of Fort Wagner, Douglass meets with Lincoln, and Douglass advocates that it's a couple of different conditions. One is that black troops should be paid the same as white troops. Black troops should be able to be promoted to officer, as well as black folks should be able to be commissioned as officers. Douglass also believed that essentially if the Confederacy or the Confederate Army did not take black troops as prisoners of war, there's, I don't know if people know Fort Pillow, and there were other incidents where the Confederate Army did not take black troops as prisoners of war. They just killed them all. That basically Douglass said, if they kill one of our black troops, we should respond in kind and kill the Confederates. So Douglass was pretty radical, basically advocating to Lincoln that he should have a policy that better protected black troops. And Douglass also is encouraging Lincoln, using the Battle of Fort Wagner as an example, that says basically, if you really want to win this war, we should fully enlist and arm free black folks, and essentially help to have a policy that encourages slaves to self-emancipate, and then they can join the U.S. Army. So that's in 1863. In 1864, Douglass returns to the White House and meets with Lincoln. And in one of these visits, there's an account that Douglass is sitting in the reception area, and there's another guy who's waiting on the president. And I guess Douglass is like reading a newspaper, and the guy is like looks at Douglass and says like, "Excuse me, sir, are you the president?" And then Douglass kind of looks around and says, "It's just kind of interesting." I figured all the details out, but Douglass had an interesting sense of humor. So so Douglass meets with Lincoln in 1864 when Lincoln's re-election is looking uncertain, and we know the details of their meeting because Douglass sends a letter to Lincoln essentially saying, this is what we discussed. And it says something to the effect of, Douglass said, I agree with you, Mr. Lincoln, that essentially if you lose the election in November, it will be disastrous towards emancipation and abolition, and basically that my fellow brothers and sisters will not be treated favorably by the McClellan administration, etc. So Douglass says to Lincoln, if you lose the election, I will go down to the South and help to essentially emancipate some of the largest plantations and be one of your kind of like secret agents. That's a rough paraphrase of the correspondence, but Then in March of 1865, Frederick Douglass attends Lincoln's second inaugural address. And there's a story, there are several accounts of this story, that Douglass is trying to attend and or crash this is a public party, so it's not crashing the party, but there's a public reception at what is today the Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., and it's a public reception for the re-election of President Lincoln. And Douglass is trying to attend, and he's being treated very roughly by kind of the security. And so Douglass says, I'm Frederick Douglass, what are you doing? And then so Lincoln hears the commotion and says, "Hey, halt, guards, let my friend go." And then so they let go of Mr. Douglass, and then Lincoln approaches Douglass and says, "Sir, Mr. Douglass, what did you think of that speech?" And Frederick Douglass says, "Well, I'm a humble servant. You really don't want to know my opinion." And Lincoln says, "No, I insist." And then Douglass says, "Sir, that was a sacred effort." It's told in many different flowery, mythical, rhetorical ways. Frederick Douglass is in Rochester when Abraham Lincoln is assassinated. Frederick Douglass in April 1876 gives the keynote lecture at Lincoln Park in Washington, D.C., where the Emancipation Memorial is unveiled. And Lincoln is the subject of that, or one of the subjects of that statue, as well as a freedman. Frederick Douglass knew Robert Todd Lincoln, who was Lincoln's son, who was the Secretary of War under the Garfield administration. And there was some speculation that Robert Todd Lincoln was going to be the Republican candidate for the Republican candidate in 1888, after they lost the election in 1884, and that Frederick Douglass was going to be the vice presidential candidate. So that's a long-winded answer for your question, because I don't want to give that short summary. All right.
Did you mention Mary Todd Lincoln in the case?
Mary Todd Lincoln sent Mr. Douglass one of her husband's canes and said, "Mr. Douglass, I would like you to have the cane of my husband as a measure of the affection and friendship that my husband Abraham felt towards you." And there are also connections essentially through Elizabeth Keckley. Elizabeth Keckley was like the seamstress and was I don't know if I use the word friend. I mean, Mary Todd Lincoln was a lady who's she had a lot of mental health issues, because she had several of her sons passed away. She was sitting right next to her husband when he was assassinated. So Elizabeth Keckley was a companion friend to Mary Todd Lincoln, and Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Keckley worked together within basically Black philanthropic networks to help have basically mutual aid societies for Southern Black folks who were freeing the South and coming up north and needed support. And so Douglass knew Elizabeth Keckley. Elizabeth Keckley was friends with Mary Todd Lincoln. So there's all these various degrees of separation. Wonderful question. Do we have any more? No. Okay. All right. I know.
Right here's a question right there.
Hold on. Did Frederick Douglass have, this is from online, did he keep a diary and is it published?
That is a wonderful question. The question was, did Frederick Douglass keep a diary and is it published? Douglass was a sporadic diarist and journalist. Well,
Writer.
yeah, there's over like 10,000 pieces of correspondence. Douglass's papers are at the Library of Congress, with the main collection. He has papers at Howard University. He has papers at Yale University, and there have been a couple sporadic publications of kind of some journals that he kept, but he did not keep like a daily, year-to-year journal. And you can go on Library of Congress and kind of search through some of Douglass's letters have been organized chronologically in correspondence files. And Yale University has published several volumes of Douglass's letters, but they're only select letters. All right, do we have maybe one more question?
Would you speak to the time lapse between Proclamation Day in '63 and the parade that was, I guess it was here, I don't know where it was, in '84?
Yes.
Proclamation Day parade. What happened between, if anything?
Well, the question is to give some clarification on that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued in August of 1862, and I guess it took effect It was supposed to take effect January 1st, 1863. So Black communities across the United States would celebrate various forms of Emancipation Days. Before the Emancipation Proclamation, Black communities would celebrate Emancipation Day as consistent with the abolition of slavery in the West Indies. I should know that exact date. I want to say it was 1838. I do not know the exact date of that. So there's a history of Emancipation Day parades and activities and festivities being held in Black communities in the United States, mostly northern areas, before the Civil War. The Civil War happens, there's Emancipation Proclamation, and following the Civil War, different communities use August as a celebration date, September as a celebration date, and some even use January 1st. So September was used as a date because I believe that's when Lincoln made it public and said that it will then take effect in January.
Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It was a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
And so Sean or others may be able to speak clearly on this. I know that Wheeling started a tradition of Emancipation Days, I believe, in the 1870s, and it continued, as I can tell, at least till the late 1890s, because Blanche Bruce is here in 1891, Mr. Lynch is here in 1896, and Parkersburg had Emancipation Day events. Shepherdstown had Emancipation Day events. So it's kind of like, like Juneteenth, which is really connected to Texas. President Biden signed legislation, I believe, last year, making that like a federal holiday. So Juneteenth was celebrated in Texas starting in the mid 1860s, and then it took all the way until 2022 or 2021 to make it a federal holiday. And so I don't know if that's answering your question, but Emancipation Day events and parades were celebrated in Black communities across the country, and they would be on different dates, sometimes in August, sometimes in September. Frederick Douglass spoke at Emancipation Day events in D.C. in April because that coincides with D.C. specific emancipation legislation. He spoke in Delaware, Ohio, everywhere. Thank you, everybody, for your time. You've been wonderful. Hashtag I love OCPL. Hashtag I love OCPL. We want to thank Sean Duffy and the Lunch with Books.
Is this your book?
Yes, ma'am.
You didn't bring any of this.
I wrote a couple.